Sekigahara, midday, 1600. A volley of gunfire slams into the mountainside, where 15,000 Allied troops have sat motionless for hours. Their 19-year-old commander stands up. In the next 10 minutes, he will destroy his own army. Why? "15,000 men sat on a mountain, refusing to fight. Their commander was 19, and he had sworn loyalty to both armies below. Which way did he charge? October 21st, 1600. In a narrow valley in central Japan called Sekigahara, roughly 160,000 men had assembled to settle who would rule the country. One of the largest contingents on that field had not been given an order all morning. It belonged to Kobayakawa Hideaki, and it sat on Mount Matsuo on the southwestern rim of the basin. 15,600 men, nearly a fifth of the Western Army, holding the highest ground in sight. Both supreme commanders spent that morning watching the mountain. Hideaki was 19 years old. He was not born to any of this. In 1582, he arrived as the fifth son of the Kinoshita, a minor warrior family with no lands worth naming. What he did have was an aunt, Nene, wife of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant-born general who within a decade would rule all Japan. Hideyoshi had no son of his own, so he took the boy into his household at the age of 3, gave him the Hashiba name, and raised him as a possible heir to everything. Then, in 1593, a concubine gave Hideyoshi a son. The child was Toyotomi Hideyori, and his birth erased Hideaki's future overnight. An adopted nephew was no longer a successor. He was an obstacle to be relocated. In 1594, Hideyoshi arranged a second adoption, this time into the Kobayakawa House of Western Japan, a powerful family inside the Mori alliance and safely far from the capital. By the age of 13, the boy had carried 3 surnames, none of them chosen by him. Twice, he had been moved to suit another man's plans. He was learning precisely what his own preferences were worth. In 1597, Hideyoshi launched his second invasion of Korea and named Hideaki commander-in-chief of the forces there. He was 16 years old. That winter, at the fortress of Ulsan, a huge Ming and Korean relief army closed in on a starving Japanese garrison. And in the fighting, Hideaki did the one thing a supreme commander must never do. He took up a spear and went into the front rank himself. To the boy, it was courage, proof that he belonged. To the officials watching from headquarters, it was a child who did not understand what his own rank meant. The report that reached Japan was severe, and Hideaki's household always believed its author was Ishida Mitsunari, the administrator supervising the campaign. The punishment was ruinous. Hideaki was stripped of Chikuzen, a domain of over 300,000 koku, and reassigned to a fraction of that in Ichizen. Then, Hideyoshi died in the autumn of 1598. And in the reshuffling that followed, one man quietly reversed the ruling and handed Chikuzen back. That man was Tokugawa Ieyasu. By 18, Hideaki had been publicly humiliated by one great power and rescued by the other. When the country split open in 1600, both sides knew exactly what Hideaki's army was worth, and both bid for it. Mitsunari's Western Army offered him the office of Kampaku, Imperial Regent, the highest civil rank a subject could hold, along with 2 provinces, to be his until Hideyori came of age. From the eastern side, Kuroda Nagamasa worked on Hideaki's senior retainers, who had already sent hostages and secret pledges to Ieyasu. Hideaki refused neither offer. He marched to Sekigahara under Western banners, carrying a written promise to betray them. On the night of October 20th, in cold rain, Hideaki did something nobody had authorized. He marched his army up onto Mount Matsuo, a fortified hill on the southwestern rim of the battlefield, and turned out the small garrison already holding it. From that summit, he could see every formation in the valley and reach any of them at a run downhill. Mitsunari sent messenger after messenger, ordering him into his assigned place in the line. Hideaki did not come. He had placed himself somewhere neither army could compel him. Dawn on the 21st came smothered in fog so thick the armies could not see each other. When it burned off around 8 o'clock, they collided at once. Fukushima Masanori's men tore into Ukita Hideiye's contingent on the western right. Mitsunari's gunners held the center, while the Shimazu beside them refused to move. The fighting swung back and forth across the muddy valley floor for hours, with neither side breaking. On paper, the Western Army held every advantage, high ground on 3 sides of an enemy packed into a basin. And on the highest ground of all, 15,000 men stood perfectly still. One commander down there was not fooled. Otani Yoshitsugu, Mitsunari's closest friend, was so far gone with illness that he directed his troops from a covered palanquin and could barely see the men he was ordering. He had heard the rumors about Mount Matsuo, so he did the only thing left to him. He turned part of his small force around to face uphill toward the Allied army above him. His soldiers fought the enemy in front while watching the mountain behind. They were standing guard against their own side. By midday, the battle had not broken, and Tokugawa Ieyasu was out of patience. He had pushed his command post forward to within sight of the mountain, and by every traditional account, he was chewing his fingers raw. Then he gave an order that had nothing to do with the enemy in front of him. His arquebusiers turned and fired a volley into the slope of Mount Matsuo. It killed almost no one. It was not an attack at all. It was a question, asked in gunpowder. Choose now. Minutes later, the mountain came down. 15,000 men poured off the slope at a dead run and struck Otani Yoshitsugu's position in the flank. This was the whole reason Ieyasu had spent months writing letters. Otani had perhaps 600 men facing that direction, and they did something extraordinary. They held. Twice they threw Hideaki's charge back up the hill. For a few minutes, the entire outcome of Japanese history rested on a few hundred soldiers commanded by a dying man in a palanquin. Then, 4 more Western contingents changed sides at once. Wakisaka, Ogawa, Akaza, Kutsuki. More than 4,000 men who had been waiting to see which way Matsuo went, turned and struck Otani from the opposite direction. His line dissolved. Otani Yoshitsugu ordered a retainer to take his head and hide it where no enemy would ever find it, and killed himself where he sat. From there, the Western army came apart in under an hour. Mitsunari fled into the hills on foot. The battle meant to decide Japan over days had been decided by one teenager in one afternoon. Ieyasu paid exactly what he had promised. Hideaki was given the provinces of Bizen and Mimasaka, some 510,000 koku, centered on Okayama Castle, making a 19-year-old one of the wealthiest lords in Japan. He had gained more from a single afternoon than his 2 adoptive fathers had given him in a lifetime. What he had not gained was a single ally. The new order accepted the defection and despised the defector, and the survivors of the army he destroyed had names for him that outlived him by 4 centuries. 16 days after the battle, Ishida Mitsunari was paraded through Kyoto in an open cart and beheaded on the riverbed at Rokujo. 87 daimyo houses were dissolved. In 1603, Ieyasu took the title of shogun, and the government he founded would hold Japan for 265 years. Hideaki governed Okayama in the middle of all of it, in a castle full of retainers who had watched him do what he did. Accounts from those 2 years describe heavy drinking, broken sleep, and a young man who would not be left alone after dark. 2 years after Sekigahara, in 1602, Kobayakawa Hideaki died at Okayama Castle. He was 21. The recorded symptoms point to a collapse brought on by relentless drinking. The stories that spread afterwards insisted that Otani Yoshitsugu's vengeful spirit had come for him, and that he died screaming at something in the room that no one else could see. He left no son. The Kobayakawa house was abolished and its lands taken back. The first daimyo family extinguished under the Tokugawa shogunate, the shogunate he had personally handed to Ieyasu. It is easy to call him a coward, and Japan has done so for 400 years. But look at what he was actually holding. He was 19, commanding an army he had inherited rather than built, in a war between the man who had destroyed his career and the man who had restored it, fighting nominally for a child whose birth had cost him everything. Both sides had already bought his officers. Whatever he did on that mountain, he was going to betray someone. Standing still was never neutrality. It was the last moment before choosing. Historians have also begun dismantling the famous version of these events. Letters written soon after the battle suggest Hideaki may have charged the moment the fighting began, rather than after hours of agonizing, and that the warning volley, the most cinematic detail in Japanese military history, may be a later embellishment. Some scholars now argue the whole battle lasted around 2 hours. If they are right, the hesitation was never the story. The story is that Sekigahara was won months earlier, in writing, by the side that understood what a frightened young man was worth. Next time on Samurai Chronicles, 4 centuries earlier, in a sea battle in the Straits of Shimonoseki, a commander watched his clan, his child emperor, and his entire world go under the waves, and chose to follow them down rather than surrender. His name was Taira no Tomomori. Kobayakawa Hideaki spent 19 years being moved around by other people's decisions, and then made one of his own. It took 10 minutes. It set the next 2.5 centuries of Japanese history, and it destroyed him. Japan has never forgiven him for it. Subscribe for a new story from Japanese history every day.